Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Guru-murthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. And my guest this week is the Indian writer Pankaj Mishra, who has written a series of brilliant books and articles over the years. I think we first met in India quite a long time ago, but you're now based in Britain, and your latest book is called Bland Fanatics, Liberals, Race and Empire, and it's fiery stuff. It's a very critical sort of diagnosis of everything that has gone wrong in the West, in what you talk about as sort of Anglo-American democracy. A little taste of it in the introduction, at the end of the introduction, is what has become clearer since the coronavirus crisis is that modern democracies have for decades been lurching towards moral and ideological bankruptcy, which is a good place for us to jump off at, I suppose. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think, when you look around, whether you're in Britain or the United States, you look at the way the political class has conducted itself. You look at the way the fourth estate, and let's not forget the fact we both belong to it. But if you look at other institutions and how they've responded to not just the coronavirus pandemic, but various other crises in the past, to the financial crisis, the war in Iraq, many others before that, we are looking at a ruling class and an intelligentsia that is increasingly incapable of rising to the major challenges of our time, whether they be political, environmental, or indeed economic, with the rise of China. Now, this is something people like myself, I'm not the only one, I should add, to make those kinds of arguments. People have been saying this for a very long time, for nearly 20 years. But, I think it was easy to ignore these voices because things on the surface seem to be all right, at least for people who were in charge of bringing the news to citizens. For them, things were okay, so they weren't really examining this too closely. But what we are really looking at are societies where the social contract has unraveled, the political class has suffered a crisis of legitimacy. We have bunglers and bullies running two of the most powerful, wealthy societies in human history. So, in a way, one doesn't have to argue anymore. In a way, this book is almost superfluous in the sense that we can all see what's happening or what has happened over the last 2 decades.
And how, for example, do you see that having played out over coronavirus?
Well, just in the way both the British and the American government responded, there were very clear patterns set by China and South Korea, where the coronavirus was initially rampant, and they responded very quickly. Vietnam responded very quickly. Taiwan. There were very clear examples to be drawn from these countries as to what to do, how to defeat this, how to roll it back. These were almost systematically ignored, and then both countries tried to deny it as much as possible, or to simply pretend that nothing was going wrong, and then to claim a kind of immunity that somehow the two countries that hadn't really suffered occupation or military invasion over the long course of the 20th century, and indeed the much of the 19th century, were also going to be somehow immune to this virus. There was a whole lot of weird, exceptionalist, almost mystical thinking behind this. And obviously the virus is no respecter of national power. And that's what we are looking at today.
And how acute is it? Is this just a chronic problem of sort of, creeping decay that we live with and accept in our societies? Things sometimes get a little better and then they get a little bit worse, and we just kind of think, well, that's part of democracy. Or are you saying there's something acute that is actually there's an emergency, we're about to go over a cliff?
Well, it is clearly an emergency. I mean, I think we are looking at a very long period of economic calamity. There's no milder word for this, what we're about to suffer. We are looking at a period of catastrophic unemployment, lots of businesses going under. It's already happening. It's already happening around us. So this is obviously something unprecedented in our lifetimes, and actually in the lifetimes of our parents and grandparents. I mean, nothing like this has really happened since the Second World War. And I think it poses a kind of existential challenge to what I would describe as the winners of history. I mean, two countries that were very, very powerful early on in the 19th century, that acquired a kind of military, economic, and cultural power that was unprecedented, completely unrivaled, and are suddenly finding themselves in very, very serious trouble. And I just don't think they're going to get out of this that easily.
I want to unpick why you think this has happened and why you think we are happy to live with this state of affairs as you see it. But I just wonder how you see, these societies in relation to yourself. Are you part of it, or do you look at it as an outsider? Do you feel like an Indian abroad looking at a decaying Western society, or what?
Well, I've had the somewhat sort of mixed experience of growing up in India. I didn't actually leave India until I was in my mid-20s. And I belonged there to a very particular social reality. I grew up in small towns. Then I went to a village and spent a lot of my adult life living in this little village. And everything I've written really comes out of that experience of growing up in India, watching politics in India, watching how the economies work, the local economies work, and then coming to the West and finding that in the late 90s, and finding that both Britain and the United States had become very infatuated with this idea of the free market, or the idea that the government is a nuisance, that the government is a problem. Ronald Reagan actually said that, that the government is really a problem rather than a solution. Now, this, for many of us who'd grown up in post-colonial societies where the government was the source of so much that was around us, everything by way of infrastructure, railway stations, factories, industries. So the idea that in some ways the government could be a problem was rather bizarre, but that was becoming the global wisdom at the time. So today, if there are shortages in Britain and the United States, they can't even find protective equipment for the nurses. It is because they have believed too much in this fanatical ideology that really we should entrust everything to the invisible hand of the market, and that the government needs to step back and let the rules and the principles of the market work things out between themselves. Now, this is obviously, as we can see very clearly today, a recipe for disaster.
But what's your own sort of, political, social background? People will probably assume you're sort of a posh, rich Indian. Is that right?
No, actually, they couldn't be more wrong. I mean, I come from, my father worked for the railways. We grew up in small towns. I think we belong to what might be called the lower middle class in India. And our experience, my experience until, I was in my 20s was limited to these small provincial places in India.
And were you brought up around political ideas? were your parents left-wing, or,
Well, no.
is this stuff you've discovered?
I grew up with parents and relatives who were all on the Hindu right. So they were all supporters of the current the party that is currently in power in India, and they had been actually its supporters right from the beginning. So right from the 1930s and 40s, and these were upper caste Hindus, Brahmins, felt a natural loyalty to this party because they were very worried about, and not saying my own parents were, but I knew people in my own family and friends and family friends who were very anxious about the rise of low caste Hindus, the political assertiveness of low caste Hindus. and indeed what they saw as the assertiveness of Muslims in India. So I grew up with many of these prejudices, and it took me a long time to actually break out of them, to see them as the prejudices of a group of people that felt very besieged. And, you can see that phenomenon now on an amplified scale in the United States, in various other parts of the world where people in positions of power, or even when people are not in positions of power but feel they have a pretty good chance at it, feel threatened by other castes or classes.
So does that make you feel you understand Brexit, Trump, and all of these things that you now regard as sort of in the same vein politically? You know where that comes from?
Well, there is certainly a great deal of existential anxiety behind these shocks and disasters that Britain and the United States have suffered. I mean, a lot of people feeling their identity, their existence really threatened by, in the first instance, the assertiveness of minorities around them, or the feeling that the minorities are being pampered by the ruling dispensation. It's an idea. It's actually a fantasy. And I think the elephant in the room here is China, the rise of China. I think that makes people extremely anxious. And obviously right now it's playing out in this new Cold War scenario against China. But the abrupt, unpredicted, and really extraordinarily dramatic rise of China has been very, very disconcerting for many people in the West.
I remember a piece you wrote after Brexit and Trump, in which you sort of mocked the analysis of the time, which was sort of hand-wringing liberals saying this has all happened because we just, we didn't spread the wealth around enough. Why do you think, and that we let communities get left behind? The sort of the conventional analysis, which was that, Labour politics had failed, poor working class communities, and had left them behind, and so they had turned to, new ideas. Why do you think that was, and do you still think that's sort of the wrong analysis?
Well, I think it's a very self-serving mode of analysis where what is being implied here is that, okay, we got a few things wrong, and give us another chance and we'll come back to power and we'll fix them. I mean, that is implicitly the promise being made by the Biden group in the Democratic Party right now, is that there is a way to go back to that period with a bit of social engineering. You might plagiarize a bit of Bernie Sanders' manifesto, bring in some social protections, make health insurance available more widely, and problem solved. But I do think the problem is actually much deeper. It has to do with the way these societies have been, in a way, indoctrinated into certain ideologies: the ideology of private interest, the ideology of private wealth creation. And everywhere you look, Donald Trump is obviously a monstrous embodiment of this particular ideology, but there are also more respectful embodiments of that. And I think the notion of collective welfare, of a society where things are being done for everyone, and it's not just a minority that is getting enriched, I feel that it will be very, very difficult to actually uproot the institutional structures that have kept these ideologies in place for such a long time. And actually not just, something emanating from one particular center of authority, but actually something that has been deeply internalized. So I think you and I, in many ways, are also, whether we like it or not, infected by this notion that we have to compete with others, that we are all slightly on our own, and it's, everyone for himself, that we're all kind of in this dog-eat-dog world, constantly performing, constantly boosting our particular brands. I suppose a conversation like this is an instance of that. So I think that, sense of all of us being on our own, striving against the odds to create a place for ourselves in the wider world. How does one get rid of this particular feeling? I think that is really actually the political and moral challenge before us. Political parties will come and go, but I think that will be the fundamental change. And I feel like the only thing that can force people to think again is the environmental crisis. The fact that life itself is a big question mark now against life on this planet. And it's, calling us to change in ways that should be truly radical.
But in order to change the way we live, we have to understand why the majority have lived within and propped up and preserved politically a system that is rationally against their interests.
If you have badly informed, badly educated citizens, if you have citizens addicted to a kind of sensationalism that the tabloids in this country, broadsheets, and television channels elsewhere have consistently offered to them, well, I mean, obviously they're going to vote for the political outcomes will be the ones benefiting the owners of these media institutions, and indeed their lackeys and cronies in the political class. I mean, so it's not that difficult to understand why the democracies today are in the bad shape that they are, is because they're simply not functioning in the way they should be, which is well-informed citizenry, a clear, transparent process of decision-making, a fourth estate that is scrupulous, that is honest. Can we honestly say that any of these institutions, any of these processes are properly working today?
So let's turn to sort of how things should change then. I mean, do you believe that the first thing to tackle is the idea that government can't do very much, or that government's a bad thing?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think, and one doesn't have to go to East Asia to look for examples of what the government can do, what a well-organized government or well-organized bureaucracy with, very strong ideas of public interest and public service, most importantly, like that in Singapore. We don't have to learn from Singapore. I mean, look at just how British and American societies responded to the calamities of first the Great Depression and then the Second World War. Obviously, the state and the government was given a great role in social welfare. I think in many ways people have been forced in both these societies to again reinstate the state as a kind of savior, really.
But what's the difference between what happened, after the Great Depression or after the Second World War, and what's happening now when Boris Johnson talks about massive investment, when we do have, the furlough scheme that's cost goodness knows what, and he now talks about intervening over things like obesity and all these sort of things where a libertarian conservative would never have dreamt of going a year ago even.
Well, I think obviously there's going to be a lot of resistance to this because, as I said earlier, I mean, these ideologies are so entrenched and so many people seek to benefit from them, seek to profit from them, that it's very unlikely that these massive, ambitious schemes of governmental supervision and policy implementation are going to be given an easy pass. I think there's going to be a lot of ideological battles ahead. But the fact is that in life and death situations such as the one we are in right now, the government simply has to assume a role.
But are you saying that we should maybe think about being a bit more like China, and saying, well, actually, the big priority is development, the big priority is equality, and we must do radical things that are completely against all our normal instincts to deliver these things first?
Well, I think one thing to learn from China, I don't think there's much to learn from China because they have their own model, which was arrived at after living a particular sequence of events. But one thing we can learn from China is its extraordinary, and this is, I think, an under-noticed aspect of China, its extraordinary ideological pragmatism. A ruling party that calls itself communist, even to this day, abandoned its foundational ideology and embraced a market economy, adapted itself to it, while keeping the role of the state central. If you remember back in the 90s, what we were told, that globalization is the means to universal prosperity, and what we need to unleashes individual dynamism, the spirit of entrepreneurship, and that's what makes societies great, do away with government and all that. All this time, a Chinese state was supervising a market economy and making China very slowly but steadily central to the world economy. So this is an example, this is actually a very interesting example of ideological pragmatism. So coming to the end of a period of ideological fanaticism in Britain and the United States, at least that is one thing we can learn from China, is how to be ideologically flexible and to do a really proper U-turn, which is what they did once they realized they had hit rock bottom in the 70s, if you remember, after the death of Mao. Desperately poor country, one calamity, one disaster after another, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution. And then in the 1980s, the turnaround began. Obviously, huge amounts of problems have accompanied China's progress. We mentioned human rights violations and the suppression of dissent, but also incredible amount of environmental damage. But nevertheless, the material progress cannot be denied. And if we want to today dig ourselves out of this hole that we find ourselves in, I think we will probably need a great deal of ideological and intellectual resourcefulness.
So what would a U-turn here mean? I mean, does it mean socialism?
Well, I think the fact is that every state has required socialism in making itself something that citizens can respect or citizens give legitimacy to. After the Second World War, even the so-called capitalist states had to adopt certain aspects of socialism. Obviously there was the Soviet Union and the Scandinavian countries which went much further down their path. But, if by socialism we take, from this sort of very, very varied meaning, we take the sense that the state is an entity that supervises and simply is not in charge of deregulating various economic and social processes. There is actually an active player in all of these processes. Even if we take that from these varied meanings of socialism, that in itself is a huge U-turn for both Britain and the United States. And we're seeing it right now. We're seeing it in real time with what Boris Johnson has been saying, what Joe Biden has been saying, because, the recognition, the acknowledgement is late, but it cannot be postponed anymore.
But you think they need to go much further, don't you?
Well, they will have to. They will have to go much further. I think there will be political pressures, because right now, as I said, we are going through a crisis which doesn't seem to be, at least ending in the next 2-3 years. And so there'll be more political disorder and there'll be more pressure from, I think, citizens.
Well, that's the question, isn't it? So how is this going to be delivered? Are you suggesting that this will come from pressure, ground up pressure from people who are disaffected? Because it hasn't happened yet. So why would it happen now?
I think now with the BLM protests and the uprisings and, this sort of extensive economic pain that everyone is feeling right now, whatever happens after Biden's victory, and I think we can take that for granted unless something really completely calamitous happens between now and November, that he'll be elected. And once he's elected, I think there'll be a lot of pressure on him from the people who will be responsible for electing him. So it will be very difficult. He will try to, of course, and the people around him will try to go take things back to where they were, but it is not actually really possible. I think new thinking is required, and the new thinking will come from, a lot of young people who are very engaged right now, who are very politicized right now, who are very smart, who are very sharp, and are also free of these triumphalist notions of Anglo-American superiority or the fact that we, the English-speaking peoples, can do certain things better than anyone else. They simply haven't inherited these obnoxious prejudices.
But when you look at the left in both America and Britain, haven't we actually seen them doing sort of the opposite of what you're saying and actually sort of moderating themselves. You know, we've been through the Corbyn experiment in British politics. It didn't work, and we see Keir Starmer now very much moderating the Labour position on all sorts of things. You know, Bernie Sanders didn't get the nomination in America, and Joe Biden is a much more centrist figure, you know, there as well. So, I mean,
I would say it's probably a mistake to see in the failure of personalities, of figures, the failures of entire belief systems and you know, ways of thinking. I think the left in both the UK and the US is a pretty resurgent force right now. You know, there are a lot of young people, I mean, demographically, most young people today are on the left, and they will in many ways define and shape the future of these countries. So let's not forget that, you know, someone in their 60s or 70s, someone like Corbyn or Bernie Sanders, may not have managed to persuade a lot of people in their respective parties and in the wider electorate, in the case of Corbyn, that they should be elected or to positions of power. But the ideas that actually brought these people to power in the first place are very much around, and they haven't gone away. In fact, what we are seeing today is the gradual embrace of those ideas by not only people in their respective parties, not just, you know, Keir Starmer or Biden, but also their embrace by the so-called right. You know, the new systems of social protection that are being put in place now in Britain and the United States. I mean, you know, you could argue this is actually plagiarizing from the left's handbook. So I would, you know, doubt very much these sort of obituaries of the leftist demise, just because Corbyn and Sanders themselves failed in their bid for power. So I feel like a lot of new thinking, a lot of new culture is going to emerge from this particular generation. I mean, we can't really expect it to happen overnight.
You just don't know what it is yet.
Well, we don't know what that is, but I think it'll be, I suppose, for the first time since the 60s, and actually potentially far more significant and powerful than the 60s, an authentic intellectual counterculture.
So why are you so convinced that we haven't just sort of reached the end of history, that, you know, that we haven't run out of ideas and alternatives to run our societies? Because you're not sure what this alternative is, but you're pretty sure it's coming.
It'll be extremely presumptuous for me or for anyone to prescribe solutions when, you know, the solutions should naturally emerge, organically emerge from particular experiences of particular social realities.
Are you sure that whatever it is will be democratic? You know, or do you think it's possible that democracies had it too?
Well, I don't really, you know, when we talk about democracy, we have to be very specific about, very precise about what exactly do we mean by democracy. I mean, does what happened today in Britain and America by way of electoral processes, elections every 4 or 5 years, is that truly democracy? Has something gone wrong there? Is democracy simply a mode of enabling majoritarianism, like in India, where, you know, people ruling the country say they have a license to do whatever the hell they want because they've been elected by a landslide, and so they have this, you know, great permission of the Indian electorate. Whereas, or is democracy a process of consensus building, a process of transparent discussion, debate, and decision making? And if those things are going to happen more often than they used to, well, I think, you know, I mean, it's what is really true is that we haven't really had much democracy, and what we need is more democracy. We need more transparency. We need more open debate and discussions. And I think, you know, in a way, I feel like that might be where we are headed. I can't be entirely sure.
So why do you think, when it's come to internal constitutional change, when asked, you know, the last 2 times, whether in Scotland or over our voting system, in this country we've just said no. Happy to do Brexit, but when it comes to different democracy or more democracy, people have said no.
Well, people can also change their minds, as they're doing right now, as we speak in Scotland and elsewhere. And I think this is what's exciting about the political process, and that's why its ends should not be prescribed or anticipated too much in advance. Is that it's a process of contention, it's a process of antagonism. And you set out your positions very clearly, you engage in debates and discussions, and you try and persuade people. This is a process that hasn't really happened in so many of our societies for a very long time. You've had a lot of people shouting at each other on television and on social media, a lot of futile, sterile debates about this or that, completely irrelevant things. By the way, I'm very grateful that you haven't asked me a single question about cancel culture yet. But, such are the distractions, the multiple, very entertaining, many of them, and so much of the media's energy, so much of the energy of people who are in the media is consumed by these trivial things. And I think, we all of us really need a dose of seriousness.
Well, I've started to wonder whether all debate is trivial now. It's partly why I prefer doing the podcast to doing a lot of the discussions that I do on the news, which are sort of inevitably just sort of polarized, should we do this or that, yes or no kind of discussions. But it doesn't seem to be possible within our political system to do anything more nuanced.
Well, this is a real problem. I think I know a lot of people in journalism, in the mainstream media, who would make a similar confession that, it's become very difficult to hold on to, these ideas of open discussions and debates. Everything is too determined by, again, this economy of distraction, that newspapers, TV channels have invested too much in this idea of getting more and more people interested in one particular event and then quickly in some other event, and then taking them from one event and personality to another without actually really having a proper conversation. But this is what so much of the mainstream media has been reduced to, is basically reporting on what is happening in social media.
Having said that, your book does pick a lot of fights, doesn't it? And I sort of wonder, are you? Do you like sort of taking other people down? Whether it's Neil Ferguson or...
Actually, that is not my intention at all. Here is the thing. If you've been given a platform at the New York Review of Books or at the London Review or at the Guardian or at the New York Times, then actually I think it is your duty to challenge some of the rubbish that is published in those pages and to say, well, actually, I can speak from a different kind of experience, coming from a different kind of historical background altogether, that this is nonsense. So the piece about Neil Ferguson in the book is an example of that. People from the late 19th century onwards in countries like China, India, have been resisting these kinds of histories of the British Empire and calling them white people's histories. I quote somebody from the late 19th century. I'm simply amplifying some of these figures and saying, this is a particular way of looking at history, which is that the British Empire was wonderful. This is what the British have told themselves by and large, although there have been some serious exceptions to that rule. And this thinking has become dominant again precisely at a time when Britain is actually going into decline, and it's feeding all kinds of dangerous fantasies about Britain's place in the world, which of course play a huge role in the campaign for Brexit. That these fantasies are dangerous. I was saying this nearly 10 years ago, that this is not an abstract discussion. This is something becoming very mainstream. The BBC is carrying this institutionalizing this kind of ideology in the programs that they're commissioning on the British Empire. So a whole generation, several generations in fact, is being indoctrinated in a particular view of empire, which a large majority of the world's population absolutely rejects, because their experience is one of exploitation, of violence, of dispossession. Now, if you make those kinds of points in a mainstream forum, you will be seen as a polemicist, as a controversialist, which is, these are words that have kind of basically haunted me, and all these years. These are the words that are thrown at you. But what else can you do? The alternative is to join the Neil Fergusons of the world and say, of course, empire was wonderful. It taught us to speak the English language.
And do you think in this world, particularly of social media and the internet, stupid ideas can rise more easily than in the past?
Well, this is one of the many ways in which social media has been detrimental to the health of democratic societies. Is that suddenly anyone with a platform can very quickly disseminate some idiotic notion or conspiracy theory of some fantasy and be embraced by literally millions of people within a few hours. We see that with Trump, the way he retweets or sometimes produces an original idiocy.
But do you think what we're seeing in America is the actual struggle that will deliver change? That you see, you can present it as the forces of conservatism trying to suppress, the people who are demanding change, and this is sort of a battle to the death.
Well, I think it's a generational battle more and more, whereby obviously there are lots of people, spreading conspiracy theories and various racial fantasies of domination. But at the same time, there are a lot of people who use social media very effectively, very intelligently. I think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez actually is a very good example of a very young politician, completely obscure one moment, and then suddenly, very, very prominent, all with the help of very intelligent arguments, rebuttals on social media and also in other traditional forms of media. So I do think there is a battle going on there. And actually, that is democracy. In a way, we should be grateful that these conflicts, these battles are happening today, and that people are having these kinds of arguments, because I don't think you can actually have a democracy without antagonism of this sort. And this is where, people will say, free speech is being curtailed or that free speech is in danger are entirely wrong, because speech has actually never been freer for most people on the planet today. What is certainly in question is the quality of the debate, and about which I've already expressed several reservations. But the debate is happening.
Can I just ask you briefly about India? Where do you see Modi on this spectrum? Is he somewhere between Trump and China?
I think what has happened in India is that the opposition has been decimated. So the media, the judiciary has been taken over by Hindu nationalists in a way that is completely unparalleled. So there is simply nothing by way of resistance emerging from those institutions, whereas there's a lot of it in the United States from the media. Even Fox News is not entirely loyal to Donald Trump. Now, you can't think of a single major television channel in India that is not repeating Modi's idiocies every day. They're total mouthpieces. They're called North Korean. It's a common term for some of these television channels. So this is, to answer your question, I think, on this particular spectrum, India is starting to resemble more, properly authoritarian state than, say, a democracy that is in a state of severe crisis. Because when you actually look at India today, you find very little resistance there that you might call, or where you might see a spark of democratic impulse.
But what you can get is sort of an authoritarian state that has the consent of the people, if the people feel looked after.
This has happened before, where despots arrived offering to make citizens feel more secure, safer, and also prouder.
And better off.
Sorry?
And better off.
And better off. And I think that's, part of, in fact, that's a large part of Modi's appeal, one that many Indians have, embraced and are very reluctant to let go of it. It's almost as if they sense that Modi is the last hope. When he's very clearly, he's a destroyer in chief in many ways. He's ruined the Indian economy, demonetization. he is now, with this botched lockdown, sentenced literally hundreds of millions of Indians to starvation, hunger, early death. And, the fact that so many people still believe that he's a savior. I mean, we're looking at a religious cult of some kind here. We moved away from notions of democracy or civil society. We're looking at people thinking, he is an ascetic, he goes and prays, and, he's there he's an incarnation, really, who's appeared amongst us to redeem India, to restore us as a proud country. And I think it's very difficult to argue against those beliefs, even as you personally suffer from the consequences of his decisions.
And do you see these things being echoed around the world? So, I mean, is it the same thing here, but on a much more modest scale when we look at Boris Johnson?
Well, I'm really very amazed by some of these opinion polls that have appeared in recent weeks, where support for the government remains high. I mean, it's shrinking, but it remains relatively high, given the disasters and calamities that people in this country have suffered under Boris Johnson's watch already, a few months into his prime ministership. And yet, there's a high level of support for the Conservative Party. And again, I think, something more than ordinary politics is at work here, and that there is a huge amount of investment in this figure, especially amongst people who had never voted Conservative, who had never voted Tory. And I think there comes a point where you're extremely reluctant to admit that you got it wrong, and that this was not the savior you'd hoped for, and that he's actually a buffoon and a bungler. But it's very hard to admit that, I think, for many people.
If I can just sort of finally bring it back to you, I suppose. Do you feel, I mean, how British do you feel now? Do you feel of this place?
I definitely feel very committed to this place. I feel very linked to its fate, to its future. And, I was linked to its past even when I was in India. Because, we grew up in a country where the British had been there. I mean, it's still extraordinary to think about it, how long they had been there. So my connection with Britain started the moment I was born. And, in one of those historical ironies, I'm now deeply connected to and deeply interested as a result in what happens next in the future.
So if you could fix it, if you could change the world, what would you do?
We talked a lot about the role of the media. And I've come to actually very strongly believe that true change will begin to happen when people from an older generation start to take voluntary retirement. So I feel like, I've just crossed not so long ago the age of the sort of landmark age of 50. And I think I've got a few more years. And, after that, I think one should look for the door marked exit and retire and actually create space for younger people. I mean, I said to you earlier, I do have a lot of faith in this younger generation, even in the generation that my daughter is in. People still preteens, and their information, the analytical abilities is just astounding. So I feel they've been having a political experience that'll make them really wise and actually capable of taking properly serious political decisions when they finally come of age, when they're in their 20s and 30s. Whereas, I grew up, I think, in pretty complacent times. And so did most of the people who are now in their 40s and 50s. I think we had it easy. And as a result, many of us are unable to reckon with everything that's happening today. So instead of struggling and prolonging this moment of futility, it's best to retreat, it's best to retire and make space for the more talented and smarter people. So I think that change is what I'd like to see, is people voluntarily giving up their positions and making space for younger people, especially in the media. Is that too much to ask?
Pankaj Mishra, thank you very much indeed for sharing your vision and your ways to change the world. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, then please do give us a rating and a review. You can watch all of these Ways to Change the World interviews on the Channel 4 News YouTube channel. Our producer is Rachel Evans. Until next time, bye-bye.